Very nice. Thank you, Kayla. And that sets the stage for our morning Faith for Living. Welcome to week 8 as we begin with Reverend Mary Ann McKibben Dana, who comes to us from Reston, Virginia. And we're very happy to have her here this morning and very happy to see all of you. By way of announcements and housekeeping, I want to remind you, first of all, that we're recording these sessions, so please turn your cell phones off. And if you need to take a call, go out of the room to do that. We have a form in the back on the back table for recordings. If you would like the recording of yesterday's sermon and the presentations this week, those will be available, and Mike Malakar will send you an MP3 file on your through your email, and you can have those. That is $10 for those for each week. And then we have our religious life seminars that are coming up. There's a paper that tells all about them, and I especially want to lift up a couple that are coming up. First of all, our Christian biographies with Dan Moulton, who will be talking about 2 of the translators of the Bible, which had a huge impact upon Western civilization and upon our Christian history. And then the poetry workshop with John Fox, which will be the last week in July. And that is something that you need to sign up for if you're going to be part of that. So I want to bring those to your attention. And then I just want to say that tomorrow we'll be having a book signing following our session here. As you know, Reverend Dana has written 3 books that we have in the fine print bookstore. The first one looks mysteriously like what's on the screen, Hope, a User's Manual. And let me just say that this is a book that you can use for small groups. There are small, short chapters that give an idea and a point, and it's wonderfully free of churchy language, so you can use it with people who may not be steeped in the faith. I really recommend it. I actually endorsed it on the front page, so you know that I recommend it. And then, God, Improv and the Art of Living, and Sabbath in the Suburbs. And again, we've used these in different contexts, and they're all worth picking up in the fine print bookstore. We'll have a book signing tomorrow after our session at 10 o'clock in the Green Gables, which is right around the corner, and it's the Green Building right around the corner. Mary Ann will be there to sign books. I want to thank Ruth Shannon and Bill Shannon and the Ruth Shannon Endowment for sponsoring this week. Our speaker, as I said, comes to us from Reston, Virginia. She is a sought-after speaker, preacher, conference leader, and writers on issues of leadership, faith formation, and congregational transformation. She's a graduate of Rice University. She received her Master of Divinity from Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. And she is currently the associate pastor at Trinity Presbyterian Church in Herndon, Virginia. And most importantly, she's a mother of 3 and an occasional, as she puts it, an occasional ultra marathon runner. I didn't see you out there this morning, but probably you streaked by so fast I didn't see you. So without further ado, please welcome to our pulpit Reverend Mary Ann McKibben Dana.
So much. Okay, I have unmuted. Can you all hear me all right? Okay. I roam around, so I'm using the lavalier mic. This is a poem from Joy Harjo, just to center ourselves, center our time together. It's a poem called Remember. Let this be our prayer to God this morning. Remember the sky that you were born under. Know each of the stars' stories. Remember the moon. Know who she is. Remember the sun's birth at dawn. That is the strongest point of time. Remember sundown and the giving away to night. Remember your birth, how your mother struggled to give you form and breath. You are evidence of her life and her mother's and hers. Remember your father. He is your life also. Remember the earth whose skin you are. Red earth, black earth, yellow earth, white earth, brown earth, we are earth. Remember the plants, trees, animal life, who all have their tribes, their families, their histories too. Talk to them. Listen to them. They are alive poems. Remember the wind. Remember her voice. She knows the origin of this universe. Remember you are all people and all people are you. Remember you are this universe and this universe is you. Remember all is in motion, is growing, is you. Remember language comes from this. Remember the dance language is, that life is. Remember. Amen. Well, as Charlie mentioned, and as we explored yesterday in the Hoover Auditorium, our focus this week is hope. And when I tell people that I write about hope and preach about hope and study hope and think about it, people say, what a timely topic. And I always say, when is it not an important topic? But it feels especially salient to many of us as we endure what I am coming to call the 2024 of it all. And so it is holy work that we do here. We know that the Apostle Paul lifts up faith, hope, and love that abide. He says the greatest is love, but I want to file a minority report and say maybe hope is the greatest, or at least for me the most grounding. And we'll talk more about where this work of hope came from and why I came to write this book and speak to groups about this topic. But today I want to orient us and explore some different facets. We'll do that all week. When I sought to write the book, as Charlie mentioned, it's a series of very, very short reflections. I wrote it during COVID. I did not feel like I had the capacity to write long, sustained theological arguments. I wanted to look at hope from a number of different facets, like you'd look at a diamond. And some of those reflections may kind of contradict one another or explore things from completely different angles, and I feel like that is spiritually appropriate to where we are right now. We live in complex times, and so I wanted to give us a lot of different entry points to hope. And so I wrote a book of a lot of bite-sized pieces in the hope that what people needed to read at this time was also just a little bit of manna for each day. I think there are 46 reflections, and they're organized into sections. So you could do one a week, and then you could mix 6 weeks, and it would take you the whole year, right? Or you can do a 6-week study, because there's 6 sections to the book. However you want to explore it, if you're interested in reading the book, the intent was for it to be something that you do something with. That's why we called it a user's manual. But what we're going to do this week is some of what I'm going to share with you is in the book. A lot of it isn't. I like to supplement, and I don't like kind of rehashing over and over again the same stuff. So some of what I'm going to share is new and is not in the book, but is kind of something that sits alongside it. So today our topic is we're going to start from the very premise of do we need hope? Is hope necessary for us? How do different cultures, people, generations think about hope? How do we think about hope? And that's where I want to start. So if you're a note taker and you have some paper, you might get that out. If you're not, just kind of reflect on these. I'm going to put 4 statements up on the screen, and I'm just going to give you a little short silence to fill in the blank. These are 4 statements that you would finish the statement. And I invite you to, again, jot those down if you're somebody who thinks through writing, or you can just reflect in your own mind. The first statement is, I hope that. I hope that. Second statement, I hope for. third, I have hope despite. This was the topic of our sermon yesterday. And finally, I put my hope in. I put my hope in. Over here, I see some people taking pictures. And if anything, goes for all week long, if anything that I say grabs you and you didn't have a time to jot it down, I'm very easy to reach on the internet. And if you send me a message, I'll be happy to send you that quote or where'd that video come from or whatever. We're not going to unpack these, although we will have Q&A time, so I'd be interested in the answer to this question, which is, did one of these statements kind of resonate more deeply for you? Did one of these kind of flow a little better for you? One of the things that I try to do in my work around hope is, I don't know, I'm a Presbyterian. I don't know what your faith commitment is, but a lot of us, especially those of us in mainline Protestantism, we love to love God with like this, 12 inches of real estate, right? Neck up, loving God with our mind. And one of the things that I really tried to uncover and think a lot about hope is that hope also lives in our bodies. In fact, we're going to talk about that, I think, on Wednesday. This is an embodied phenomenon, hope. It's not just getting our thoughts right about God and what God is up to in the world, but how do we live out as people of hope? How do we live that hope? So I'm curious in that vein if there are certain of these that you find yourself kind of more easy to access. Right now, I am feeling that third one a lot, that I'm feeling the sense of needing to have hope even in the midst of, even despite so much that feels like it is coming, as I said yesterday in the sermon, unspooled. I want to grab onto hope as a life raft in the midst of these stormy seas. So I'm really just digging into, I have hope despite. It's a defiant kind of hope, right? And I think as people of faith, that is often, regardless of what's happening in the world, we cling to that hope. But we also, and what we want to talk about today and unpack a little bit, is that we have what I have come to decide and feel are some views of hope in culture that can feel inadequate, but also can be just downright maladaptive. And we're going to talk about those a little bit. So we're going to talk about the ways that hope is a cultural phenomenon, something that we experience differently depending on what our cultural context is, what our experience is. I was walking through the airport some time ago, and I caught a glimpse of this billboard. And you've probably seen similar ones. This is a campaign with lots of different virtues, generosity and compassion and all of these. This one was optimism. It will get brighter, right? And I think this is a view of hope, and we'll talk in a minute about the difference between optimism and hope. And hope during our discussion time we'll have a chance for you to weigh in on that. But there's a whole series of these around optimism. Another favorite one. On the 10,000th try, there was light, right? Thomas Edison. That is optimism. And I think there's something particularly American about that view. We are a can-do people. I won't say uniquely American, because I think there are other cultures that kind of have that sense of forward-looking and keep going and that dogged determination. But I do think there's a particularly American flavor to that. We are a culture, a nation that has done incredible things. But I want to get us to something that's even deeper than that. And I want to tell a story to kind of flesh out what I mean. And if you've read the book, sorry if this is a repeat. But the book really first germinated in a conversation I was having with a pastor named Aaron. I am a leadership coach. I work with pastors in addition to being a pastor myself. And Aaron was pastoring a small, kind of scrappy, justice-oriented congregation down in the Bible Belt. And they had dwindled in numbers year after year. And in the meantime, he saw all of these mega churches kind of bursting up all around him. And he was feeling discouraged. He's like, I'm doing what I'm called to do. We are doing great work for the Lord. And I just can't, we just can't stem this kind of gradual decline of numbers, dollars. And this is a common story. I hear this all the time from faithful pastors, loving communities. We are in a tremendous cultural shift, which is beyond what I'm going to be talking about, but you could bring in speakers to talk all about those cultural upheavals that are happening all around us. But he was feeling that, right? And we got to talking about, I don't know how the conversation got to there, but we talked about that phrase from Mother Teresa, who said, we are called not to be successful, but to be faithful. And I don't know how we got on that topic, but we were just kind of bandying that about. And he said, you know, I learned that in seminary, and I really grabbed onto it. It has been a grounding conviction of mine for these decades that I have been in ministry. But he said, I think there was always this unspoken subtext to it, which is that if you are faithful, then you will be successful, right? And here I am, being as faithful as I know how to be, encountering the Jesus I meet in Scripture and trying to meet him out in the world. And I'm not sure that my church is going to exist in 10 years. So he helped highlight for me this kind of cultural connection of doing the right things, which will bring about successful results, right? And we see that, I think, in this. The 10,000th try there was light. And this is what our culture runs on and has been such an important fuel for great innovation. But what it can do is it can discourage those who are feeling like, I am doing the right thing. I'm on try number 9,000, and I just don't know I have it in me anymore, right? And so what can happen is we can get stuck into what I would call a false hope, a maladaptive version of hope, which is we have hope, going back to those statements, we have hope that everything's going to work out okay, right? Well, what does okay mean? What does work out mean? The devil's in the details there, right? And so I think what often happens when we have these cultural messages of just keep going, it's going to be all right, just keep pushing, keep going, God's going to figure this out for you, is we get into what is known as toxic positivity. And we see this come out in all kinds of different ways. If you want to delve into this, Dr. Susan George has done a lot of work in how toxic positivity, we sometimes grab onto that. I talked about hope as a life raft. I think toxic positivity is a life raft with a hole in it, right? It's only going to get us so far. It's the kind of false, superficial, everything's great, kind of, we see it on social media with our kind of putting forward our best face, and how that can be, for people like Aaron, who are seeking to follow God and do good work, it can feel very, very oppressive, right? To kind of have this, just buck up, be optimistic, it's all going to be okay. And so what I wanted to do in my exploration of hope is really come right at that and say, we can do better. And I think even we in the church will often kind of default to messages of positivity when I think that biblical hope is much deeper. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But this comes out in all kinds of different ways. I was listening recently on Richard Rohr's podcast. He was interviewing Kate Bowler, which she will be here next year, I heard, yes. So, oh, sorry. I just broke news here in the Orchestra Hall. Sorry about that. You can edit that out of the recording. Sorry. She is an incredible writer, thinker. Her own personal story you can read about in her many books. She is a student and professor of the prosperity gospel, which is a very kind of American flavor of Christianity. Again, not uniquely, but this idea that if you do X, Y, and Z, if you have enough faith, God will bless you. with wonderful prosperity, with health, with all of those things. And then the alternative to that is if you suffer, if you do not have wealth, if you do not have the things you desire, then you don't have enough faith. And that's prosperity gospel in a nutshell. So they were talking about this. Kate is an Anabaptist, Mennonite, did not grow up with a prosperity gospel, but only realized when she was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer how much she had internalized that, because it's just free-floating in the culture, right? And so when she received this diagnosis, there was this, but I'm a good person, but I've devoted my life to following God and studying and trying to share God's good news as a professor and all of these things. And so the two of them really explored this beautifully in this conversation on Richard Rohr's podcast. And what happens is, let me read this here. And this came out in the conversation. So growing up hearing that God wants you to be healed, God wants to bless you, it's about to happen, you're almost there. There's kind of, that's how prosperity gospel preachers kind of keep people hooked in, is like, you've almost gotten it, just a little bit further, right? 10,000 try there was light. And so what I think, Kate and Richard talked about in their conversation, what I'm trying to do is think about what does hope look like right now? What if hope isn't a destination that we reach, but a ground that we stand on right now? What does it mean to have hope right now in the stage 4 cancer diagnosis, or on the 9,000th try of trying to create electricity, right? That, to me, is a robust hope, because, as I said yesterday in the sermon, so much of God's work is going to happen after we are no longer here. What does hope look like in the midst of that, right? And this kind of prosperity gospel idea has even leapt over into the secular world in this idea of manifesting. I don't know if you all have heard this term or maybe have used it yourself, but it's like, I can make this happen, right? You just need to manifest what you want. Envision it, set that intention, and that intention will help get you there, right? Again, it is this future orientation to hope. It's this, we can get there if we just knuckle down enough, work, me and God kind of figuring this out together. And I feel like we can do better. I feel like there's more deeper waters to plumb in the midst of this. And I also think that ultimately, that kind of hope, that if you do this, then good results will happen. There are little threads of that. I mean, people have grabbed onto that in Scripture. There are some places where you can grab onto that. But the whole of the biblical story, I think, is a different kind of hope. And Rabbi Jonathan Sachs would agree with me, who said that optimism and hope are not the same. Optimism is the belief that the world is changing for the better. Hope is the belief that together we can make the world better. Optimism is a passive virtue, hope an active one. It needs no courage to be an optimist, but it takes a great deal of courage to hope. The Hebrew Bible is not an optimistic book. It is, however, one of the great literatures of hope. And one of the things we can talk about a little bit during the Q&A time, you probably didn't know that the Q&A was going to go both ways. I'm going to give you some cues to think about too, and you can give me some cues cues to A, going both ways. I agree that the Hebrew Bible is a great literature of hope and not fundamentally an optimistic book. I think it goes beyond that. And one of the things I would ask is, would you agree that the Christian Testament, the New Testament, is also a book of hope, but perhaps not an optimistic book? When I think about optimism, I think about what we can see. And I think optimism is, in some ways, there are people, you probably know them, who are naturally optimistic, always able to see the bright side. I just saw somebody look at their spouse. I won't call them out, but right? So I don't know if it's like you recognize me or I recognize you. For those of us who are not naturally optimistic, who may tend in a little more of the Eeyore direction. Oh man, how's this going to go wrong, right? There's good news for us, because I think we can cultivate hope as a muscle, as something that helps us get beyond that natural, what's next kind of orientation, to be people of purpose. And for my purposes, when I think about what hope means, hope is what gives us the agency and the motivation to act in a positive direction to help make things happen that we think are important, right? So what is that fuel? Hope for me is a fuel. So how do we cultivate that fuel? How do we build those muscles for hope? All right, so the next little piece I want to share with you. So we've talked a little bit about how the culture talks about hope. And one of the things I love to do, here's another cue to throw at you. I'm curious, before we move off of culture, are there books that you like to read, aside from the Bible, perhaps, that kind of, if you just need a little bit of hope, or a song you like to listen to, a movie that you like to watch? A lot of people like Shawshank Redemption because hope is the best thing, right? If you know that story. TV shows, like I'm always collecting kind of our reading list, our viewing list. So if you have those things that you just need a little shot in the arm of hope, let me know, or let one another know in our discussion time. So we talk a lot about it, and we've inherited from our own theological history a very rich tradition around hope. Throughout the ages, we have had a number of theologians who have really hit upon what hope is about. I think when I think about hope and our theological tradition, I think of Jürgen Moltmann, 20th century theologian, who is perhaps one of the most prolific to write about hope. His theology of hope is deeply Christian. It's deeply grounded in the future. For him, Christianity is eschatology. Eschatology is, of course, concerned with the final things, where we are headed as a people. It is forward-looking and forward-moving, but because it is forward-looking and forward-moving, it has implications on how we live right now. So we're not just kind of waiting around for the sweet by and by. Because we believe that what God wants ultimately for us is wholeness, is justice, is peace, is grace, all of these things, that has implications for how we live now. So hope is revolutionizing and transforming the present. And so it has implications in the everyday life of the Christian. How do we live now in light of the future? It is the Christian lens for perceiving reality. So when we look at what's going on around us, that filter that we look through is Christian hope for Moltmann. And for him, the idea of hell is hopelessness. The idea that we don't have hope. That idea of hell is separation from God. If we are separated from God, then where is our hope, right? And I think that probably feels pretty familiar to a lot of us, whether we've read Moltmann or not. This, I think, is a pretty common understanding of where hope comes from. I want to offer for you, or give an ethicist that we'll listen to in a minute, the opportunity to offer an alternative view, a critique of Moltmann, if you will. And I want to offer this in a particular spirit. I think I find this, we're going to hear in a minute, pretty compelling. But even if it's a little further than you would want to go, I invite you to listen with an open heart anyway, and here's why. I had the honor of studying theology from Shirley Guthrie, who literally wrote the book Christian Doctrine. When I was a student at Columbia Seminary, he filled in for the regular theology professor who was on sabbatical. He was retired at that point, but came back into service to teach us newbies about theology. And I remember one time he said, we were talking about heretics and the various heresies that popped up in the history of the church, and he said, here's the thing about heretics. Heretics always deserve a hearing. Heretics should be listened to, because they are emphasizing something that is being neglected in orthodoxy. I'm not saying that the person we're going to hear from is a heretic, but I'm offering that as an example. So even if you go, it's a little further than I can go, what is he emphasizing that maybe Moltmann and our traditional Christian view of hope may be missing? Miguel de la Torre is a Christian ethicist. He teaches at Iliff Divinity School. He has his roots in Cuba, although he grew up in New York. And he wrote a book called Embracing Hopelessness. Now, remember what I said a minute ago, that for me, hope is that thing that gives us agency to act. If we have hope, if we are people of hope, then we're not just going to sit around and wait for God to just magically make it okay, but we're going to ask God's guidance to help us be agents of change and hope, right? So for me, hope is that push, right? And what Miguel de la Torre does in his work around embracing hopelessness is, if you come from a background, if you come from a socioeconomic place where you don't have a lot of expectation that you're going to get out of that things are going to get better for you, where do you find that push to act? Okay? So he's trying to figure out where that comes from. We're going to listen to him speak. This was back in 2020. Charlie mentioned yesterday that I've done a lot of work with Next Church, which is a movement within the Presbyterian Church to kind of figure out what's next for the church in this changing cultural context. And we heard Miguel de la Torre speak about his work around embracing hopelessness. We're going to listen to just a few minutes of that. So this is my cue to tell our sound booth to be ready with our sound. Again, listen with open ears and heart to a little bit of an alternative view to what we've received from Moltmann.
Uplifting message. So why am I so down on hope? I have chosen to stand in radical solidarity with the oppressed of the world who live in Holy Saturday. When I work on the border and I visit children in cages, they are living in Holy Saturday. And to tell them it's all going to work out, that all things work for good, is somewhat disingenuous of me, because it's not all going to work out. And even when they leave those cages, the psychological damage will haunt them for the rest of their lives. So to stand in the Holy Saturday, not knowing if there even is a resurrection on Sunday, is to lose control of time and history and be in the moment of anxiety and not knowing. When I was writing the book, Embracing Hopelessness, one of my students, who was a member of a gang, got arrested and was sent back to prison. And with my permission, he took my manuscript with him. And he began to do a study among the other gang members who were in prison based on my manuscript. And they got it. They understood what I was talking about, because they are among the most marginalized. And that's who my audience is. Those who understand the hopelessness and any visions of hope all too often appear but an illusion. Hope is successful in domesticating me. When I was in Auschwitz, they had that sign over the gate that said, "Work will set you free." It did not. You went through those gates, and more than likely, you were going to die. But if I had hope that work would set me free, maybe I would work hard, keep my head low, not make eye contact, and maybe I'll survive, even though I would not. You see, hope becomes a way of controlling people. Hope in losing the little that I have keeps me quiet and docile. But when I have no hope, when I realize I have nothing to lose, that's when I'm the most dangerous. That's where I'm trying to get my people to realize that by embracing hope, nothing will change because they're afraid of losing the little crumbs that they have. So I have to ask, where is God in all this? Well, if I read the biblical text clearly, sometimes God is simply absent. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? And I know we like to sometimes save God from God and try to give a theology that, no, basically Jesus is quoting a verse from one of the Psalms and bringing us back to that to show that he really is the Messiah. Yeah, no, I think Jesus truly felt forsaken on that cross and cried out in the midst of that hopelessness. And that's okay. Because
goes on from there. There was a lot in that, so let's unpack it a little bit. What De La Torre is trying to do is talk about the ways that hope can domesticate and pacify those who are marginalized, right? I heard this in 2020, and those of you who were here yesterday or maybe have delved into the book know that we went through a significant kind of mental health situation with our eldest, Caroline, who has given permission to tell that story. And this was life-changing for me to hear this because as I said yesterday, it's hard when you're in a situation like we were in as a family to stay present to what was going on. Of course, we wanted her to get better. We wanted things to improve. And I always struggle with whether to put this in the sermon. People came out afterwards like, how is Caroline doing now? Caroline's doing very well. Caroline's in college and is just crushing it, and we just could not be more grateful for that. And part of the reason that I don't say that in the sermon is because I think we need to figure out what hope looks like even when we haven't gotten to that happy ending, which may not be an ending, right? Because this can come back, right? So how do we stay present and purposeful in the moment? That's the kind of hope that I'm striving for. And so that's why I find this critique so compelling. Because even if you don't feel hopeful, we are called to be people of hope, right? And we also need to acknowledge that there are ways that we have talked about hope that perhaps has played into this dynamic of it's all just going to be okay. Just hang in there a little longer. And what that can do is keep people pacified and passive, right? And so I love what he has to say about Holy Saturday. Every year when we get to Holy Week and we kind of go through Palm Sunday, we get towards Maundy Thursday, we have our Last Supper together, and then there's Good Friday. And whatever, I don't know what you all do in your communities, we will often do the kind of last words of Christ or a tenebrae where we extinguish those candles, and then we all go home in silence. And I think, I wish that God would give us all amnesia just for the next 24 or 36 hours, right? Because we know Easter's coming, right? We're going to put on those Easter bonnets and the tie with the, Easter eggs on it. But they didn't know. Those early disciples didn't know. And what the people Miguel de la Torre is talking about don't know. They are in a Holy Saturday. And preaching at them that it's all going to be okay is not going to get them out of Holy Saturday. Movements of liberation are going to do that. And so for De La Torre, where people can act even when there is no hope, for him, the the push is around desperation. I got nothing left to lose, so I need to act, right? And we'll tell some stories tomorrow that, that kind of encapsulate this. Tomorrow is our day where we'll talk about the story of hope and different kind of stories that we tell and how they can be bearers of hope and not. The power of desperation, he talks about this in his book. Joder is a Spanish word that I will not translate literally here, but those of you who know Spanish may know what that means. It's a crude word, but I will say that it loosely translated means to mess with, to screw with. I think you probably know what he's trying to lift up here, but what happens, what he's lifting up is an ethic of joderón, which is to mess with the powers that be. When you have nothing left to lose, you're going to do whatever you can to help yourself to be heard, right? And so if you have no power, if you feel like you are on the margins, the best you can maybe do is just kind of throw some wrenches into the gears of the dominant culture. And that is where De La Torre finds his purpose. Now, I need to be really clear, and he was clear too in his reflections of this. He is speaking for himself, and as he mentioned, he has a student that got this idea of hopelessness. But he is not speaking for all marginalized communities. There are ethics of hope that you find throughout the Black church and all kinds of places, right? But I think offers a provocative question for us, which is hope necessary? Or is hope the way we usually define it helpful, right? I want to offer up a couple more voices, again, in the spirit of kind of minority reports, alternative views. Here are two scientists who work in the natural sciences, of course, the famous and wonderful Jane Goodall, who has a podcast that's called the Hope Cast. So we kind of know where she's coming from, which is hope is important. Hope is what keeps us going. Ayanna Johnson is a climate scientist, different generation, different racial ethnic perspective, and they had a conversation on Jane's podcast recently that was so interesting because you could hear Ayanna Johnson and her great reverence for this incredible thinker, anthropologist, Jane Goodall, who's like, well, you got to have hope. And Ayanna says, that's not what animates me, the idea of hope. And what she was saying is, even if the projections around our planet are as accurate, the worst case scenario is as accurate as they say, maybe it may be even too late to forestall the worst effects. We still should do what we believe is right. She says, why would I do the wrong thing just because it will be successful? I want to do unsuccessful. Why do I just messed that. Let me read the quote because this will help us out rather than paraphrasing. All right. And this is actually Ayanna Johnson's colleague, Kinder Pierre-Lewis, who's also a woman of color. She says, I think that's why I don't like hope, because hope has this expectation that's tied to an outcome. So if you don't think you're going to achieve that outcome, then what's the use in trying, right? But what she is shaped by, and Ayanna Johnson says this in her work as well, is the idea that there's a right thing to do and there's a wrong thing to do. And why would I do the wrong thing just because the right thing isn't going to give the effect that I hope for? Does that make sense? So we need to get caught trying and determine what is moral, what is right, and go from there. And so the last little bit I want to show you is also tying into this generational perspective. So many of you know Greta Thunberg, young woman who has taken on this issue of climate as her life's work at a young age. And it's interesting. I would challenge you all to talk to the young people in your life and ask how they think about hope. I had this conversation with my own kids recently, and they were like, you know, we don't really think about hope that much. And they're not they find other ways of motivating and finding a way forward. So and Thunberg herself says, I don't want your hope, I want your panic. I want your action. Because again, going back to De La Torre, hope can give us an excuse to kind of wash our hands of it. It's going to be okay. This is all going to work out all right. And we need action. So whatever gets you to action, I think, is the important thing. Austin Channing Brown writes a lot about race and class in this country. And when Jacob Blake was shot in Kenosha, Wisconsin, she posted this tweet which says, I get asked about hope a lot when talking about race in America. White folks usually mean, are you optimistic? But black folks connect hope to duty, legacy, and the good fight. You see the difference there? And again, we're painting with broad strokes here. I think you can find all kinds of varieties of views of hope. I don't know how many people are in this room, but that's how many different views of hope we will have. The freedom movement, she says, can't survive on optimism. There's too much to mourn. So legacy, duty, the good fight. And I think that's what we see in this idea of, I don't want your hope, I want your action, your panic. Whatever's going to get you going, right? Okay. So that sets the stage for us a little bit. I am ready to have some back and forth here. So I think we've got folks with microphones. Yes, there they are. Okay. So let's talk. Okay, we've got somebody way in the back there, making you walk all the way back. So, yep.
So I really like your image of hope is fuel, and fuel can move us forward, but it can also burn us up. Yeah. And it seems to me that often when we get burned up, we have perhaps an expectation that hope is around our own ability to row the boat, our own actions. And I heard you say, you know, this idea of taking action, that's where, but, and maybe as a Presbyterian, you can relate to the idea that sometimes we fail to realize that there's an eschatological project that God has going, and it doesn't depend on our individual action ultimately, which is not to say we shouldn't row our boat in alignment with the way the river is moving. You want to riff on that a little bit?
Yeah. I agree with you. I think that's the tension that we live in, right? As Teresa of Avila said, Christ has no hands but ours, right? And this is the way God chose to work in the world, through us, despite us, in spite of us as well. And yeah, I'm a Presbyterian, so we're big on the sovereignty of God. Not that others don't uphold that, but that's kind of one of those essential tenets of the faith for us. And so what that means is whatever, and this is work that I've done myself personally too, with my own ministry coach. Whenever something's going on and I'm like, well, that's, I'm at a loss. You know, that setback kind of. And she says, you don't know the future. That's become our mantra, right? You don't know the future. This terrible thing that has just happened seems like it's just the end of things. But you don't know what's going to happen next, right? And that is very enlivening for me. The idea that God is not done with us yet. And that God, in that eschatology, again, that we are headed somewhere. As Buechner says, the worst thing is not the last thing. That is the hope and the faith and the love that we stand on. But I agree with you about the fuel. I mean, I shared that with a group of pastors, that De La Torre quote and the video. And one of the guys came up to me afterwards and he said, I did a lot of mission work in Africa. And he said, I met people who were so desperate that they were willing to take up arms and become suicide bombers, right? And I was like, oh man, right? That's the implication of this. I don't need to solve it. I don't need to resolve it. I can hold both of those and multiple of those things together. But I think what you said is beautifully expressed. I think you're absolutely right. It's not all up to us, right? So there's one down here. Yeah.
I'll talk about a Lakeside issue. The room will mostly know what I'm talking about. You will have no idea.
Go for it.
But a meeting on Saturday. Some people in this hall were hopeful. Many people, I think, felt hopelessness. And I think everybody knows what I'm talking about, but it's a Lakeside governance issue. A correction on Edison. It didn't take him 10,000 times. He had lots of experiments that made light, and so did people before him. His 10,000th time was it made light that lasted long enough to be practical.
Yes, yes. Those of you who remember the last time I was here, which was 5 years ago, we talked about improvisation as a spiritual practice and what we do when life doesn't go according to plan. And maybe you can kind of see where improv kind of gives way to hope, right? I mean, these books that I write kind of build on each other, because when everything hits the fan, where do we find our ability to act? Or where do we find our sense of peace that we don't have to have the ultimate, we don't need to know how this is all going to turn out. We can trust in a God who is working in us and through us, and again, sometimes despite us, right? And so, to the Edison point, even our missteps and our stumbles, or even I generate light and it lasted for 10 seconds, that teaches you something, right? It's iterative. Yeah. That's right. That's right. And even something that doesn't work, well, that's another thing I can eliminate as a possibility, right? I mean, we learn so much through failure. I put that in air quotes because failure is a teacher. So, yeah. Dee Dee.
This is very timely for me. I was talking yesterday with my son. My son's a public defender in Washington, D.C., and his clients are basically, he said, hopeless. And he just finished a month-long murder trial. And he talks about, I mean, they're raised in poverty, and the only hope they have is through gangs. And that gives him hope and a sense of something to do and what he can possibly do about it. And, he tries to get them into programs and does his best. His job is actually like a mission for these people. Yes. But they're just at the bottom of, they have no hope except through stuff that's going to get them in trouble.
Right.
And that's where he finds them.
Yes.
And it's terrible.
Yeah.
And I admire him for work. Well, he was raised in the church, and it's really like a mission.
Yeah.
So,
well, I'm curious. Maybe we can talk later, Dee Dee. But I'm curious how does your son find the fuel, the strength to keep going when dealing with populations of people that don't feel hope and maybe are kind of justified in not feeling at least hope in the here and now, right? I mean, we want to, again, there is this eschatological project in many kind of minority groups in Christianity is there. So anyway, go ahead.
he goes to church. He goes to church a lot.
Yeah, well, and that's, I mean, this idea of gangs, it's a sense of I got nothing else, and here's a community. I mean, if nothing else, we can understand why, I mean, we don't endorse it, right? We don't endorse where those gangs take, but I totally have empathy for, I'm just me, I cannot, but here's this group where I have an identity, I have a sense of community, and again, it takes people into destructive directions, but it certainly is understandable. So, yeah, why don't we go down here, and then I think, did you have a, okay. Yeah, I'm watching our time here, so good stuff.
I'm really taken by the artwork and the concept that in the big picture, all of our hopes are entangled. So individual little experiences are really not biblical. The biblical picture, the real eschatology, is a tangle of all of our hopes. And the most important thing is we're not tied to the outcome.
Yeah, yeah.
If we put all our energy in outcome, we don't live in the moment.
Yes, yes.
And all we have to do is faithfully live in the moment.
Yeah.
And that trust, that's really trust, the outcome will eventually produce the big,
Yeah.
well, look at it this way, retrospectively, we are the outcome of all our past entanglements, of our parents, our grandparents,
Yes.
all the lives and frustrations and sorrows and joy, we're the living embodiment of that.
Yeah.
So I like the idea of hope. Well, the whole idea of entanglement is really crucial, but I just had to express myself. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, it's beautifully said. I would just, yeah, let that stand. It's really well said. Yeah. Charlie, were you going to say something?
I'm intrigued by the De La Torre quote, and there have been a few times when I felt like I had nothing to lose, and so it was tremendously empowering, and in a way it was hopeful, even though there wasn't hope. Can you say any more about that?
Yeah. I'll go ahead and tell this story now that he tells of, he tells a story in his book, Embracing Hopelessness, of the Young Lords, which is a gang, Puerto Rican gang in New York. And they were asking the city, this was decades ago, to pick up the trash in their neighborhood. Like they weren't keeping to the schedule, the stuff would pile up, and they just weren't getting any traction with the kind of usual way of calling, petitioning, all that stuff. So they decided they had nothing else to lose. I mean, the trash was piling up. So they needed to embody that spirit of joder, right? Messing with the powers that be. So they took all the trash, they gathered it up, and they put it and kind of dumped it in one of the posh areas of Manhattan. And it was a holiday weekend where everybody's trying to get out of town. And they got arrested, which, yeah, I mean, that's kind of their point. But the New York Times showed up and took photos, too. And after that, the city started picking up their trash again. So nothing left. They had exhausted all of the proper channels. And what do we have to lose now? We're going to have to put our bodies on the line and engage in some creative disobedience here. So that's one of the stories that he tells. Yeah, there, and then we'll let you have you'll be final word.
I wanted to express a concern about the De La Torre's argumentative process. I think he sets up a straw man and then continues to knock it down. As he defines hope as the opposite of action. And it is not. Hope is action. Hope is an attitude that has to be accompanied by action. And I'm discouraged by the way he presents that. I think he's got a good point. Desperation leads to action, but hope leads to action or should lead to action also.
Yes. One of the critiques of the critique could be, is he actually critiquing hope, or is he critiquing a maladaptive version of hope? That's very simplistic, and I think that's well taken. Yeah, go ahead.
You may talk about this week more, but there's another emotion or state between hope and hopelessness, and that's grief, so that we're not just white-knuckling. When we see all these things, when we experience all these things, are we white-knuckling? Are we stuffing our feelings? Are we not being open about that. And it feels like that's a very therapeutic process. But how do we do it in a way that doesn't completely wipe us out so that we are not capable of hopeful action?
Yes.
That's a place I find myself right now, is really struggling with the grief of how awful things are, how the cruelty, all of it.
Yes, right. And I think that feeds into the toxic positivity, right? We want to get past the grief as quickly as possible into the redemptive story, which is why I struggle with, do I tell people where Caroline is now? It is a hopeful ending, but it also, I don't want people to think that, I mean, that kind of detracts from what I'm trying to say, which is that wherever we are right now is where we need to be. And if we are in that grief, we're going to regret short-circuiting that, because where we're going to land is probably not as solid a place as if we just let ourselves stay in that grief a little bit longer than the culture wants us to do, which is get over it as quickly as possible, right? Yeah. Beautiful place to stop. It's 10:01. Thank you all for your time, and we will be back here tomorrow to talk about story and stories of hope and how we think about our lives as a story of hope.
Yeah, let me say in conclusion, we're off to a great start this week. And I want to say, because she just confirmed last week, Kate Bowler will be with us on July 24th next year for a keynote speaker. And if you don't know the name, Google her. And that same week, Father Greg Boyle will be here as our preacher of the week. So that will be a star-studded week for us at Lakeside. The very day that Father Boyle received the Presidential Medal of Honor from Joe Biden, he let me know that he would be coming to Lakeside with all the requests that he has. He'll be coming to Lakeside next summer. Amazing. So we're very excited about that. So with that, have a good day at Lakeside.
Yay.